Out of nowhere, my son became unusually attentive and prepared a natural herbal remedy for me, insisting it would help because my blood pressure was dangerously high. Instead, I passed the cup to his wife, who'd been complaining about stress. An hour later, she was clawing at her throat in terror. "I'm glad you're here with me. Stay with my story until the end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Courtney, and I never imagined that a simple cup of tea would expose the darkness hidden inside my own son. At 60, I thought I'd already witnessed enough of life's cruelty, but nothing could have prepared me for what I uncovered that autumn afternoon when Henry arrived with what he called his special herbal blend. It was a Tuesday in October when Henry knocked on my door, something he hadn't done in months. Ever since his father died 19 years earlier, the distance between us had only grown. Our relationship had withered into stiff holiday phone calls and an occasional tense family dinner. So when I opened the door and saw him standing there with his wife Avery, both of them smiling a bit too brightly, my first reaction was suspicion. "Mom, you look tired," Henry said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite them. His gaze swept across my living room with an intensity I wasn't used to. "Have you been taking care of yourself?" The question felt wrong coming from him. At 37, Henry had rarely shown any real concern for my health or happiness, not since he was a teenager. After his father's death, he had blamed me for not somehow stopping the tragedy, as if I could have leapt in front of a drunk driver who ran a red light. The guilt I already carried was heavy enough without my own son's accusations. "I'm fine, Henry," I answered, closing the door behind them. "What brings you both here?" Avery shifted uncomfortably beside him. Her usual self-assured air was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite define. She kept her eyes off mine, studying the framed family photos on the mantel instead. Her auburn hair was pulled back tightly, and I noticed her hands trembling around the strap of her purse. "We've been talking," Henry said, dropping down onto my velvet green sofa as if it belonged to him. "Avery and I think you need more support. You're not getting any younger, and living alone in this big house, it's just not safe." A cold shiver went through me. Only 2 months earlier, I had received the phone call that changed everything. My brother Robert, the one person who had always truly understood me, had died suddenly of a heart attack. He left everything to me, a beautiful property at Lake Tahoe and $350,000 in savings. It was an inheritance that finally gave me a sense of security I'd never had before, but it also seemed to awaken a sudden, intense concern for my well-being from people who hadn't cared much in years. "I managed just fine," I said, moving into the kitchen to put some space between us. Normally, the small ritual of making coffee helped steady my nerves, but that day my hands shook as I scooped the grounds. Henry followed, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Mom. Look at you. You're clearly under a lot of stress. Your blood pressure has to be through the roof." He wasn't wrong about the stress, though he had no idea why. After Robert's death, grief had wrapped itself around me like a heavy coat, and I suddenly had to make financial decisions I'd never dealt with before. Robert had always been the one to call and ask how I was really doing. Without him, the silence in my life felt enormous. "I brought something that might help," Henry said, reaching into a canvas bag I hadn't noticed. He pulled out a small mason jar packed with dried leaves and stems. "I've been studying herbal remedies lately. This is a special blend, great for circulation and calming the nerves." I stared at the jar, my thoughts spinning. Henry had never been interested in natural medicine. In fact, he used to mock my love of herbal teas and home remedies, calling them hippie nonsense whenever I suggested them instead of conventional treatments. "Where did you learn about this?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "Online research," he answered quickly, too quickly. "There are so many amazing resources about traditional healing methods now. This combination has supposedly been used for centuries for stress and high blood pressure." As he talked, I noticed Avery standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. Her face looked washed out, and she kept flicking her eyes between Henry and me like she was desperate to say something but couldn't. When our gazes met, She dropped hers immediately. "Let me make you a cup right now," Henry said, already reaching for my kettle. "You'll feel so much better. I promise." The urgency in his voice unsettled me. This didn't sound like a casual suggestion from a caring son. There was something rehearsed about it. I watched as he filled the kettle and moved around my kitchen with practiced ease, like he'd done this many times before. Just not here. "Henry, I appreciate the gesture," I said, "but I've already had coffee." "Mom, please." He turned to me, his expression suddenly earnest. "I know we haven't been as close as we should have been since Dad died. I know I've failed you as a son, but I want to fix that. I want to take better care of you." The words hit a tender place inside me. For years I had wished he would admit the distance between us, that he would show some real desire to rebuild what we'd lost. Maybe, I told myself, I was just overthinking things. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe this really was his attempt to reconnect, I told myself. "Avery's been encouraging me to reach out more," Henry added, glancing at his wife. "Haven't you, honey?" Avery gave a stiff nod, but something in her face made me hesitate. She didn't look supportive. She looked terrified. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and a fine sheen of sweat had appeared on her forehead despite the cool October breeze drifting through my open kitchen window. The kettle began to whistle, and Henry moved quickly to take it off the burner. He carefully measured the herbal mix into my favorite blue porcelain teacup, the one that had belonged to my grandmother. Watching him touch something so sentimental, something sacred to me, felt wrong. "This needs to steep for exactly 7 minutes," he said, pouring the hot water over the herbs. The liquid turned a murky brown almost instantly, and an unfamiliar bitter smell filled the kitchen. "The timing is crucial for maximum effect," he added. 7 minutes. Such a precise instruction for someone who supposedly learned this from casual online reading. I found myself studying his face, searching for any trace of dishonesty, but Henry had always been skilled at masking what he really felt. "I don't know," I said slowly. "The smell is very strong. Maybe I should start with something milder." "Nonsense," Henry replied, stirring the mixture with one of my silver spoons. "Strong medicine needs strong ingredients. Trust me, Mom, have I ever steered you wrong?" The question landed like a cruel joke. Henry's choices as an adult had caused more heartache than help. His sudden, intense concern now felt staged, almost like he was reading from a script. Avery spoke up suddenly, her voice barely more than a breath. "Maybe Courtney would rather have regular tea today, Henry. This smells really intense." Henry's head snapped toward her. For a split second, I saw it. Pure, sharp anger flashing in his eyes before his polite smile slid back into place. "Avery's been under a lot of stress lately, too," he said in a casual tone that sounded anything but natural. "Work has been overwhelming. Maybe she could use this as well." I looked more closely at Avery. She did look stressed, but not like an overworked teacher dealing with rowdy kids. This was a different kind of tension, the kind you see in someone carrying a heavy, dangerous secret. "Oh, I couldn't," Avery protested quickly. "I'm sure Courtney needs it more than I do." "Nonsense," I heard myself say, not entirely sure why. "If you're both so worried about stress, there's enough for 2 cups." I reached for another teacup from the matching blue set and began to pour half of the steaming liquid into it. Henry moved as if to stop me, then froze and forced his hand back to his side. "Actually, Mom, the dosage is calibrated for 1 person," he said. "If you split it, neither of you will get the full benefit." "Then let Avery have it," I replied, passing the brimming cup toward her. "You can bring more another time, and I'll try it then." Avery's hands shook so violently I thought she might drop the cup right there. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. But there was no gratitude in her voice, only dread. Henry watched her with a strange intensity, his expression unreadable. There was anticipation there, and something disturbingly close to curiosity, the way a scientist might watch an experiment. "Go ahead, honey," he urged. "It should still be warm enough." Avery lifted the cup to her lips and hesitated for a heartbeat before taking a small sip. Her face twisted instantly. "It's incredibly bitter," she said, setting the cup back down. "Effective medicine usually is," Henry replied smoothly. "Try a bigger sip. You need enough to make a difference." The way he watched her made my skin crawl. This wasn't concern, it felt predatory. Avery took another, larger sip and forced it down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her eyes widened with sudden panic. "I feel—" she started, then stopped, pressing a hand to her throat. "What is it?" I asked, moving toward her. "My throat," she gasped. "It feels tight. And my stomach." She bent forward slightly, clutching her abdomen. Henry jumped up from his chair, but instead of going to his wife, he went straight to the sink and started rinsing the jar that had held the herbs. "It's probably just the strong taste," he said without looking back. "Some people have very sensitive palates." Avery's breathing turned ragged, sweat beaded across her forehead. "Henry," she choked out, her voice strained. "Something's wrong." That's when I saw it clearly, the look on my son's face when he finally turned around. There was no real alarm, no genuine fear, only calculation. The teacup slid from Avery's trembling hand, shattering against the kitchen floor. Blue porcelain pieces skittered across the white tiles, stained with brown liquid. Avery collapsed into the nearest chair, gripping her throat, fighting for each breath. And in that moment, watching my daughter-in-law spiral into distress far too quickly and violently to be a coincidence, the truth finally crystallized. That tea had never been meant for Avery. It had been meant for me. The next morning dawned with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually lifted my mood, but I woke with a weight in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. The shattered cup, the look in Henry's eyes, Avery gasping for air. It felt less like a memory and more like a warning I was only just beginning to heed. Henry had rushed Avery to urgent care, telling everyone she'd probably had an allergic reaction to something she ate earlier. He'd been almost theatrical in his concern, guiding her to the car, holding her arm, loudly promising to get her help right away. To anyone else, he might have looked like a worried husband, but I had seen his face before that. And I knew better. But I remembered the way he'd paused before helping her, those precious seconds where he simply watched her struggle, his expression disturbingly similar to scientific curiosity. That morning, I made my coffee in a different mug. I couldn't bring myself to use any of the blue porcelain set. The sight of those shattered pieces across my kitchen floor had felt like a bad omen. While sweeping them up the night before, I'd noticed several shards still stained with that bitter brown liquid, and the smell rising from them made my stomach twist. Around 10 a.m., my phone rang. Henry's name flashed on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. Part of me wasn't ready for whatever neat little explanation he'd prepared overnight. "Mom, I wanted to update you about Avery," he began, his voice clear and perfectly pitched with concern. "The doctor said she had a severe allergic reaction. Her throat was pretty swollen, and her digestive system was inflamed." "Allergic to what?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "They're not entirely sure," he replied. "Could have been something she ate for lunch, or maybe one of the herbs in that tea blend. You know how sensitive some people are to natural remedies?" The casual way he said it made my skin crawl. "Is she feeling better now?" I asked. "Much better. Thanks for asking. They gave her medication to reduce the inflammation, and she's resting at home today. But, Mom, it really got me thinking about how careful we need to be with herbal treatments. Maybe we should stick to more conventional methods for your health." I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. Yesterday, he'd been practically evangelizing about his special blend. Now he was ready to abandon herbal remedies altogether. "That's probably wise," I said, curious to see where he was going with this. "Actually," he continued, "I was wondering if I could come by later. I think I left my reading glasses on your coffee table, and I'd like to check on you after all the excitement." I didn't remember seeing any reading glasses, but I agreed anyway. After hanging up, I walked through my house more carefully than I had in years, looking for anything that seemed out of place. In the kitchen, I checked every jar and container, making sure nothing had been switched or tampered with. That's when I noticed something odd about my spice cabinet. The dried herbs I used for cooking weren't where I'd left them. It was subtle, but after 40 years of running the same kitchen, I knew my system. The oregano jar was now in front of the basil instead of behind it. The cinnamon sticks had migrated to the wrong shelf entirely. Someone had been going through my herbs, and I was almost certain it hadn't been Avery. When Henry arrived that afternoon, he came bearing gifts, a bouquet of supermarket flowers and a small paper bag from the health food store downtown. "I felt terrible about yesterday," he said, handing me the flowers with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "So I brought you some chamomile tea instead, much milder and safer for someone with your blood pressure." I accepted the flowers but eyed the paper bag warily. "How do you know about my blood pressure?" I asked. Henry froze halfway out of his jacket. "You mentioned it yesterday, remember?" he said quickly. "You said you've been feeling stressed since Uncle Robert died." I was certain I hadn't said anything about blood pressure, but I chose not to correct him. Instead, I invited him in and made us both coffee using my regular beans. Nothing new, nothing altered. As I moved around the kitchen, I watched him from the corner of my eye. He was scanning the living room again with that same intense focus as the day before, his gaze lingering on certain items with an expression I now recognized: calculation. "You know, Mom, this house is really too big for one person," he said, settling into my late husband's favorite armchair. "Have you thought about downsizing? Maybe moving into one of those nice senior living communities?" The suggestion hit like a splash of ice water. "I'm 60, Henry, not 90, I said sharply. "And I love this house. Your father and I built our entire life here." Of course," he said quickly, raising his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "I just worry about you rattling around in all this space, and the maintenance costs must be huge." In truth, thanks to Robert's inheritance, money was no longer something I had to lose sleep over. The $350,000 he'd left me, plus the valuable Lake Tahoe property, meant I could live comfortably for the rest of my life. But every instinct I had told me that sharing those details with Henry would be a mistake. "I manage just fine," I replied, handing him his coffee. "I'm sure you do," he said smoothly. "But still, if you ever decide to sell, the market's really strong right now. A house like this in this neighborhood could easily go for $400,000, maybe more." $400,000, I repeated silently, watching his face. His eyes brightened just a little when he said it. Combined with Robert's inheritance, I realized I represented nearly $750,000 in potential wealth. The thought made my hands tremble slightly as I lifted my cup. "Have you given any thought to updating your will?" Henry asked then, his tone light, almost offhand, like he was asking about my plans for the weekend. "I know it's not a pleasant topic, but Dad's been gone almost 20 years now. Your situation has changed a lot." There it was, the real reason behind the sudden visits, the forced concern about my health, the comments about my house. Henry wasn't worried about me. He was worried about what I would leave behind. "And what makes you think I haven't already updated my will?" I asked. His coffee cup stalled halfway to his mouth. "Have you? That's not really something I need to discuss with you right now, is it?" The silence that followed felt heavy. Henry set his cup down and leaned forward, slipping into his persuasive salesman tone. "Mom, I hope you know I'm not asking out of greed or self-interest. It's just that estate planning is really important, especially when there are significant assets involved. You don't want the government taking a huge chunk in taxes, and you don't want to leave Avery and me scrambling to figure out your wishes if something unexpected happens." "Something unexpected?" I repeated. "Well, at your age, health issues can come up suddenly," he said, almost clinically. "That's why yesterday scared me so much, seeing you so tired and stressed. Heart disease, strokes, accidents. Those risks go way up after 60. The way he listed them off, so cold and factual, sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded less like concern and more like a forecast. "I'm perfectly healthy, Henry," I said. "My last physical showed no heart disease. My cholesterol is normal and my blood pressure is only slightly elevated from the stress of losing my brother. Still, he persisted, it would give me such peace of mind to know everything is in order. And if there's anything I can do to help with the paperwork or legal details. I stood up abruptly, needing distance. I think I can handle my own legal affairs. Thank you. Henry stayed seated, but I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the room, straightening objects that didn't need straightening. When I turned back, I caught him staring at my left hand. My mother's diamond ring, which I wore every day, held his full attention. That's a beautiful ring, he said. I remember Dad mentioning it was quite valuable. It was my mother's engagement ring, I replied. She wanted me to have it. And will you pass it on to Avery someday? I know she's always admired it. The assumption in his question almost knocked the breath out of me. I haven't really thought about it, I said. Well, when the time comes, I hope you'll consider keeping it in the family. It would mean a lot to have that connection to Grandma. The word family sounded hollow coming from him. Considering how little he'd wanted to do with me until Robert's death suddenly made me financially interesting. Henry finished his coffee and stood, but not before wandering through my house again, supposedly still searching for his missing reading glasses. I followed him, watching the way his gaze moved, taking silent inventory of anything valuable, the antique furniture my husband and I had collected, the paintings Robert had gifted me over the years, the silver tea service from our wedding. I still don't see those glasses anywhere, he said finally, completing his loop. I must have left them somewhere else. At the front door, he paused and pulled a business card from his wallet. I met someone last week who specializes in estate planning, he said. Very knowledgeable, very discreet. If you ever want to go over your options, give him a call. I took the card without reading it. Thank you. And Mom, he added, maybe we should get together more often. Weekly visits, maybe. I feel like I've missed so much of your life lately. After he left, I sat down in the living room and finally looked at the card. It wasn't for an estate attorney at all. It was for a company that buys homes quickly for cash, targeting elderly homeowners who need to liquidate their property fast. I walked to my computer and for the first time in years started researching something that had never even crossed my mind before. The effects of certain herbs on older adults, especially those with high blood pressure. What I found made my blood run cold. The combination of herbs Henry had brought the day before could indeed cause throat swelling and digestive distress in the short term when taken in a strong dose, but the long-term effects were worse. According to several medical journals, regular use could lead to gradual liver damage, kidney issues, and cardiac irregularities, conditions that, in a 60-year-old woman, would look like natural age-related decline. Even more chilling was a thread on an online forum. Someone had asked about the therapeutic dosage of that exact herbal combination for an elderly relative with hypertension. The username was Henry B. 1987. 1987, the year my son was born. I printed out the forum page with shaking hands. The timestamp showed it had been posted 3 weeks earlier, right after Robert's death had been announced in the local paper. 3 weeks ago, my son had started planning my death. That evening, as I sat in my kitchen with the printed pages spread out in front of me, the truth finally settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. Avery's accident hadn't been an unfortunate side effect. It had exposed what Henry was really doing. That tea wasn't a loving gesture from a worried son. It was a trial run. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at those forum printouts, reading and rereading Henry's questions about therapeutic dosages for elderly relatives. Each time I tried to convince myself there had to be some innocent explanation. But there was no mistaking the clinical tone, the way he asked about long-term damage to an older person's organs, or how to hide the bitterness so the drink would go down more easily. On Friday morning, I made a choice that would change our relationship forever. Instead of waiting for Henry to make his next move, I would force the issue. I needed to look him in the eye and hear from his own mouth what he intended to do to me. I called him at work, something I almost never did. His cheerful voice when he answered made my stomach twist. "Mom, what a nice surprise. Is everything okay?" Henry, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come by this evening? He paused. When he spoke again, his tone carried a note of concern that might have sounded genuine if I hadn't already seen behind the mask. Of course. Is this about your health? Have you been feeling worse? We'll talk when you get here, I said. Come alone. What about Avery? She's been wanting to check on you since her reaction to the tea. Alone, Henry. After I hung up, I spent the day preparing for the hardest conversation of my life. I printed extra copies of his forum posts, including the ones where he asked about cumulative effects, whether repeated doses would mimic natural aging, and how to keep symptoms from raising suspicion. The cold precision in his words made me feel physically ill. Henry arrived at 7 on the dot, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing that same practiced smile he'd worn during every recent visit. He looked relaxed, self-assured, a man who believed everything was going according to plan. You sounded serious on the phone, he said, following me into the living room. I brought your favorite Pinot Grigio. Maybe we can talk over a glass of wine. I don't think wine is appropriate for this conversation. Something in my voice made him stop. For the first time since all this began, I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. I sat down across from him and laid the printed pages on the coffee table between us. I found something interesting online yesterday, I said. His gaze dropped to the papers, and I watched his face transform. The moment he recognized his own posts, the artificial warmth vanished. In its place was a cold, calculated expression I had never seen on my son before. You went through my browsing history? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't have to, I replied. You posted these in public forums, using your birth year and your username no less. Not very smart for someone planning what you're planning. Henry leaned back in his chair, and for several long seconds we just stared at each other. When he finally spoke, his voice no longer sounded like the concerned son he'd been pretending to be. So, he said quietly, you know. I know you've been researching ways to slowly harm elderly people using herbal mixes, I answered. I know you brought me a tea specifically designed to damage my organs over time, and I know that when Avery accidentally drank it instead, you sat there and watched her suffer to see how well it worked. Henry picked up one of the pages and glanced over it almost lazily, as if we were discussing a cooking experiment instead of attempted murder. You make it sound so sinister, he said. I was researching natural health options for age-related conditions. Don't lie to me anymore, Henry, I snapped. I read every post. You asked how to make symptoms look natural. You asked about doses that would cause a gradual decline. You asked how to hide the bitterness. You even asked whether anyone would be suspicious if an elderly person died of apparent heart failure after months of deteriorating health. And what did you conclude from your little investigation? He asked, setting the paper down with deliberate care. I concluded that my own son has been planning to kill me for my inheritance. The words hung in the room between us like poison. Henry didn't deny it. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the garden where I'd spent so many peaceful afternoons. Do you have any idea what it's like to be drowning in debt? He said quietly, while your mother is sitting on $750,000 in assets. The casual confession hit me like a blow. He wasn't even pretending anymore. Henry, if you needed money, you could have asked me, I said. We could have figured something out. He turned around then, and the look on his face was pure contempt. Ask you? He scoffed. And listen to another lecture about budgeting and living within our means? I've heard those speeches my entire life. So you decided to kill me instead, I said. I decided to help nature along, he replied coolly. You're 60, Mom. You've had a full life. Avery and I are still young. We have debts, dreams, plans. All of that takes money. The icy calm in his voice was more terrifying than rage would have been. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment outburst. It was a calculated decision made by someone who had weighed my life against his plans and found my life expendable. How long have you been giving me those herbs? I asked. I asked the question, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. This was actually the first attempt, Henry said calmly. I needed to test the mixture, make sure it behaved the way I intended. Avery's reaction was very informative, although she reacted more intensely than you would have. The dosage was calibrated for someone your age and weight. A wave of nausea rolled through me. He was talking about my planned death with the same cool tone he might use to describe a business strategy. "And if I'd drunk it instead of Avery?" I managed to ask. "You would have felt a little unwell for a day or two," he replied. "Nothing dramatic, but your liver and kidneys would have started processing toxins they're not built to handle. Over several months with regular doses, your organs would begin to show signs of strain. You'd feel more tired, have some digestive troubles, maybe a few heart palpitations, and eventually," he shrugged lightly, "eventually you'd suffer what would look like a natural heart attack or stroke. Very sad, but not at all unusual for someone your age, especially under the stress of grief and financial pressure." The clinical precision of his explanation was horrifying. He had considered every stage, every excuse, every outcome. This wasn't impulsive. This was deliberate, calculated murder dressed up as natural decline. "What about Avery?" I asked. "Is she part of this?" For the first time, Henry hesitated. "Avery is complicated," he said. "She knows about our financial situation. She knows we need a solution, but she doesn't like the details." "You mean she's squeamish about murdering your mother?" I said. "She prefers not to think about the methodology," he replied flatly. "She just wants the problem to go away." I thought of Avery's nervousness, her shaking hands, the way she'd avoided my eyes. She might not have mixed the herbs herself, but she was far from innocent. "So what happens now?" I asked, "now that I know what you've been planning?" Henry sat back down, and I watched him weigh his choices. The mask was gone. The person sitting across from me was a stranger wearing my son's face. "Now," he said at last, "we need to have a practical conversation about your estate planning. Because one way or another, Avery and I are going to inherit your assets. The only question is whether you want to cooperate and make things smooth, or make this difficult for everyone." "You're threatening me," I said. "I'm giving you options," he corrected. "You can update your will and leave everything to us, then maybe take a nice long trip. Lake Tahoe, for example. Robert's property is pretty isolated. Anything could happen to someone traveling alone at your age." The implication hit me like ice. He wasn't just willing to poison me slowly, he was ready to arrange something far more immediate if he had to. "And if I refuse?" Henry's smile was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Then we go back to the original plan," he said. "You've already been exposed once, when Avery spilled that tea. There are traces of it in your system now. If you were to have another little accident, slip, fall, hit your head, an autopsy would show elevated levels of certain compounds that might have contributed to dizziness or disorientation. Very tragic, but easy enough to explain." In that instant, everything became painfully clear. My son was a sociopath. Either the boy I believed I'd raised had never really existed, or he had been swallowed whole by greed and narcissism so deep that he could calmly engineer my death. "You're insane," I whispered. "I'm practical," he replied. "And I'm done waiting for you to die on your own, while Avery and I struggle. You're sitting on money you don't need, letting it gather dust, while we run ourselves ragged trying to pay off credit cards and student loans." "I earned that money," I said. 40 years of hard work and saving. Robert left his estate to me because he trusted I'd use it wisely." "And what's wise about hoarding wealth while your own son is drowning?" Henry shot back. "You live alone in a $400,000 house. You have more money in the bank than most people ever see. Meanwhile, Avery and I are buried in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, scared to even think about having kids because we can't afford them." The self-pity in his voice made me sick. In his mind, he was the injured party in all this. "So you decided I don't deserve to live," I said. "I decided your death would be more useful than your continued existence," he answered coolly. "You've already had most of your life. We're just beginning ours." I stared at him, and something inside me finally snapped. Whatever fragile strand of maternal love I'd still been holding on to broke under the weight of his words. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. "I'm afraid we're past that," he replied. "You can't just send me away and pretend this conversation never happened. You know too much now, and I know that you know. That changes the timeline." "What do you mean?" Henry slipped a hand into his jacket and pulled out a small vial filled with clear liquid. "I brought a backup plan tonight in case our conversation didn't go the way I hoped," Henry said calmly. "This is a concentrated version of the herbal mixture, dissolved in a tasteless solution. It can be added to any drink." My heart pounded as the meaning sank in. "You're going to force me to drink that?" I whispered. "I'm going to give you one last chance to cooperate," he replied. "Sign over power of attorney to me tonight, and you can spend the rest of your life in a nice care facility where you'll be comfortable and well looked after. Refuse, and I'll put this in your coffee. By morning, you'll be sick enough to need hospitalization." "You would really do this to your own mother, just to secure your future and Avery's?" "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. I stared at the vial in his hand, understanding that I was standing at the edge of a life-or-death choice. My own son, the child I'd carried, raised, forgiven, supported, was ready to kill me for money. But Henry had made one critical mistake. He had misjudged me. He saw me as weak, old, alone, a soft target who would cave to pressure. He had forgotten the woman who survived his father's death and spent 2 decades fighting to keep us afloat. He thought I would simply surrender. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The shift from loving son to calculated captor had happened so gradually that I almost didn't see it until it was complete. After our confrontation that Friday night, Henry didn't leave when I told him to. Instead, he settled into my living room as if he owned it and started making phone calls. "Avery, honey, I'm going to stay at Mom's tonight," he said into his phone, his voice oozing the same fake warmth he'd been using on me. "She's had a bit of an episode and I think she needs supervision." An episode. As if discovering his murder plot somehow proved I was losing my mind. When he hung up, he turned back to me with that chilling, controlled smile. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about wanting me to leave," he said. "Unfortunately, that's not really an option anymore. Now that you know about my research and my plans, I can't risk you doing something impulsive, like calling the police or changing your will in a fit of spite. This is my house, Henry," I said. "You can't just decide to move in." "Actually, I can," he replied calmly. "And I'm not moving in permanently, just until we get your affairs in order. Think of it as a temporary arrangement while we transition your estate planning to something more appropriate for someone in your condition." "What condition?" I demanded. "There is nothing wrong with me." "Isn't there?" he murmured. He pulled out his phone and opened a notes app. "Let's see. Today you accused your loving son of trying to poison you, based on some internet posts you misunderstood. You became agitated and paranoid, making wild accusations about murder plots. You refused to listen to reason and demanded I leave, despite your obvious need for support and supervision." A wave of cold dread moved through me. "You're creating a record," I said. "I'm documenting your declining mental state," he replied smoothly. "Very sad, really. The stress of Uncle Robert's death has clearly taken a bigger toll than we realized. It's not uncommon for people your age to develop paranoid delusions, especially after a major loss." "No one is going to believe I'm anything but perfectly lucid," I insisted. "Are you?" he asked softly. "Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a confused elderly woman who's been living alone too long and has started imagining threats that don't exist." He stood and walked to the front door, turning the deadbolt with a sharp click. Then he went to the back door and locked that too. I watched, horrified, as he calmly secured every exit in my own home. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "Making sure you don't hurt yourself," he said. "People with paranoid delusions sometimes wander off at night or call authorities about imaginary crimes. I'm just trying to keep you safe." I reached for my phone, but Henry was faster. His hand clamped over mine, his grip firm enough to hurt, but careful enough not to bruise. "I don't think you need that right now," he said in a gentle, patronizing tone, easing my cell phone out of my hand. Too much stimulation can make episodes worse. Henry, this is kidnapping, I said. You can't hold me prisoner in my own house. I'm not holding you prisoner, he replied. I'm providing care for a family member in the middle of a mental health crisis. Big difference, legally. The casual way he referenced legal consequences told me he had thought this through, just like he had with the herbs. This wasn't panic. This was part of the plan. Now, he went on, settling himself in my late husband's favorite armchair. Let's talk about next steps. I've made an appointment for you with a geriatric psychiatrist on Monday morning. Dr. Brennan is highly recommended for age-related cognitive decline. I am not going to see any psychiatrist, I said. Of course you are, Henry replied. You'll go willingly because you want to get better, and Dr. Brennan will evaluate your condition and make recommendations about the level of care you need. I suspect he'll decide that living alone is no longer safe for someone in your condition, Henry said calmly. I felt like I'd been dropped into a nightmare where everything I said and did was being twisted into proof that I was losing my mind. And what happens after this appointment? I asked. That depends on you, he replied. If you're cooperative, if you admit you need help and support, then we can arrange appropriate care. Maybe a nice assisted living facility where you'll be monitored and given the medications you need. Medications, I repeated. Dr. Brennan will almost certainly prescribe something to help with your anxiety and paranoid thoughts, Henry said. Antipsychotic medication can be very effective for people experiencing the kind of delusions you've been having. With every word, the picture became clearer. Once I was sedated and placed in a facility, it would be easy for Henry to gain control of my accounts and property. Anything I tried to say about what he was doing would be dismissed as more evidence of my illness. And if I'm not cooperative? I asked quietly. His expression hardened just a little. Then we moved to more immediate solutions, he said. You've already been exposed to herbal preparations that can cause confusion and disorientation. If you were to have an accident while in a compromised mental state, it would be tragic, but not entirely unexpected. The truth hit me like a wave. I was completely at his mercy. He had my phone, my keys, and had locked every exit. He'd already built a storyline in which I was unstable, confused, and paranoid. Any attempt to fight back would only support his case. I need to use the bathroom, I said, desperate for a moment to think. Of course, he replied. But I think it's best if you leave the door open. People with your condition sometimes fall in small spaces. The humiliation of having my privacy stripped away was almost as crushing as the fear itself. I walked to the bathroom with as much dignity as I could manage, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. In the mirror, I studied my own reflection. I didn't look like a confused old woman. My eyes were clear, my posture straight, my expression focused, but I knew none of that would matter if Henry succeeded in pushing his narrative onto a doctor prepared to see dementia and delusions. When I returned to the living room, Henry was at my desk rifling through drawers with cool, methodical precision. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Important documents," he said. "Insurance papers, bank statements, your will. I need to understand your full financial situation so I can manage things properly." "Those documents are private," I said. "Not anymore," he replied. "As your primary caregiver, I need access to all relevant information about your health and finances." He pulled out my will, the one I had updated just 6 months earlier after Robert died. I watched his jaw tighten as he read certain clauses. "This is very generous to various charities," he remarked, not looking up. "Almost like you care more about strangers than your own family." "I believe in supporting causes that matter to me," I said. "Well, we'll have to revisit these allocations," he replied. "Someone in your condition shouldn't be making major financial decisions without guidance." Next, he found my bank statements, and I saw his eyes brighten as he confirmed the balance in my savings, $350,000. Then the smaller balances in my checking and money market accounts. "Very impressive nest egg," he said. "Far more than any one person needs for their remaining years." That money represents a lifetime of careful saving, I answered. And now it represents security for the next generation of our family, he said smoothly. Uncle Robert would want his inheritance to benefit his nephew and his nephew's wife. Don't you think? The way he twisted Robert's memory made my stomach turn. My brother had trusted me with that money because he knew I wouldn't squander it, least of all on Henry's greed. Henry continued his search with the thoroughness of an auditor. He found my investment statements, insurance policies, the deed to the Lake Tahoe property. Each discovery seemed to sharpen his focus. "You really are quite wealthy," he said at last. "Much more than I realized. This changes some of my calculations." "What calculations?" I asked. "How long this process needs to take," he said. "With assets of this size, it's worth taking a little extra time to make sure everything is handled correctly. We don't want to rush into anything that might raise questions." I understood. He was adjusting his timeline. The more there was to gain, the more cautious he had to be. "I'm hungry," I said, suddenly aware that I hadn't eaten since lunch and that hours had passed. "Of course," Henry replied. He stood and walked toward the kitchen. I moved to follow, but he turned and stopped me with a gentle, patronizing smile. "Actually, why don't you rest in your chair?" he suggested. "I'll take care of dinner. You seem tired and stress is very hard on people your age." I wanted to argue, but I knew following him into the kitchen would only reinforce the narrative he was building, that I needed supervision, that I couldn't be trusted. So I sat down and listened instead, focusing on the sounds of him moving around my kitchen, opening drawers, cabinets, the fridge, with the easy confidence of someone who had already mapped out this space, this situation, and my life. When he came back about 20 minutes later, he was carrying a tray with a bowl of soup and a cup of tea. Both looked completely ordinary, but I couldn't stop myself from staring at them like they were weapons. "It's just chicken soup from a can," Henry said, catching my hesitation, "and chamomile tea from the box in your pantry. Nothing exotic, nothing special." "I'm not really hungry," I murmured. "You need to eat, Mom. Proper nutrition is especially important for someone under the kind of stress you've been dealing with." I took a tentative spoonful of the soup. It tasted exactly like canned soup should. The tea had the familiar, gentle flavor of chamomile with a hint of honey. On the surface, everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Accepting anything from Henry felt like stepping into a trap. "There," he said when I'd managed to get through about half the bowl. "Don't you feel better now?" I did feel different, but not in a comforting way. A heavy drowsiness seeped into my limbs. My thoughts began to slow, as if moving through syrup, and my fear and anger softened into a foggy, unnatural calm. "I think I'm tired," I said, surprised by how thick and slurred my voice sounded. "Of course you are," he replied smoothly. "It's been a very stressful day. Why don't you go to bed early? Things will look clearer in the morning." I tried to stand, but my legs felt unsteady, like they didn't quite belong to me. Henry was on his feet at once, grabbing my elbow with a firm, guiding grip. "Careful," he said with practiced concern. "These episodes can really drain you." As he walked me toward my bedroom, it became obvious that he'd slipped something into my food. Not the dangerous herbal cocktail he'd threatened me with earlier, but a milder sedative. Something that wouldn't send me to the hospital, just make me docile and confused. "Sleep well, Mom," he said, settling me on the edge of the bed. "Tomorrow we'll start making some positive changes in your life." After he left my room, I heard him moving through the house, checking locks, closing curtains, rearranging my world to fit his narrative. He was turning my home into a cage, and I was the captive. I lay there, drugged and helpless, and understood one thing with absolute clarity: this was only the beginning. When I woke up on Saturday morning, I was almost startled by how clear my head felt. The fog from the night before had lifted, leaving behind a cold, focused anger I had never felt before. Whatever Henry had used to make me compliant was wearing off, and with its fading, my own resolve came into sharp focus. Henry had made several critical errors. As I lay quietly in bed, listening to him move around in my kitchen, I began forming a plan. He thought he was dealing with a fragile, frightened old woman. He had forgotten who I really was, the woman who'd raised him alone for nearly 20 years, who had survived widowhood, grief, and decades of scraping by. I wasn't fragile. I was a survivor. When he knocked on my bedroom door at 8 I was ready. "Good morning, Mom. How are you feeling today?" I softened my voice, adding a hint of uncertainty, just enough confusion to feed the story he wanted to believe. "I'm not sure," I said. "Yesterday feels a little fuzzy. Did we have an argument?" The flicker of satisfaction in his eyes told me everything. I was playing the role perfectly. "You had a bit of an episode," he said gently. "Nothing too serious, but enough to make me worried about you living alone. Do you remember any of it?" I pretended to search my memory. "Bits and pieces," I answered slowly. "Something about Uncle Robert's will. I remember being upset about something." "You got confused about some things you saw online," he said. "You thought they meant something they didn't. It's not unusual for people your age to misinterpret things when they're under stress." "Oh." I let embarrassment creep into my tone. "I hope I didn't say anything too foolish." "Nothing we can't forget," he replied smoothly. "What matters is that we're going to get you some help. I've made an appointment with a doctor who specializes in age-related memory issues." I nodded, as though this sounded reasonable. "That's probably a good idea," I said. "I have been feeling more forgetful lately." Relief washed over his face. He had clearly braced himself for a fight, for accusations, for threats, maybe even a call to the police. Instead, he was getting exactly what he wanted, a cooperative, confused mother who seemed to accept his version of events. "I'll make you some breakfast," he offered. "You need to keep your strength up for your appointment on Monday." "That's very kind of you, dear," I said. Then I added, as if the thought had only just occurred to me, "You know, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about Uncle Robert's inheritance. Maybe you're right. It might be too much for one person to manage alone." He paused in the doorway, clearly pleased. "I'm glad you're starting to see the practical side of things," he said. "Managing significant assets takes energy and expertise. Both get harder as we age." "Exactly," I agreed. "And I've been thinking about the Lake Tahoe property, too. I haven't even been there since Robert left it to me. It seems like such a waste to let it sit empty when it could be put to better use." "That's very sensible, Mom," he replied. "The market up there is strong. It might be smart to sell while prices are high." I nodded, as if I were slowly coming around to his way of thinking. "Maybe we could drive up there this weekend," I suggested casually. "Take a look at it together. I'd really value your opinion about what should be done with it." I could practically see the spark behind his eyes. The suggestion appealed to him immediately, but not because he was interested in helping me make sound real estate decisions. An isolated property, hours from the nearest neighbor, was the perfect place to stage an accident for an elderly woman with newly documented mental health issues. "That's an excellent idea," he said. "Fresh mountain air might even help your overall health." As soon as Henry left to make breakfast, I moved quickly and quietly. I knew I had maybe 10 minutes while he was distracted in the kitchen, and I had to use every second. First, I retrieved my spare cell phone from its hiding place in the back of my bedroom closet. It was an old phone I kept for emergencies, and Henry had no idea it existed. I turned it on, typed as fast as my fingers would allow, and sent a single text to my neighbor Margaret, who lived 3 houses down and had been my friend for over 15 years. "Margaret, this is Courtney. I need your help. Henry is at my house and I'm in danger. Please don't call or come over, but if you don't hear from me by Sunday evening, call the police and tell them to check the Lake Tahoe property that belonged to my brother Robert. The address is 427 Pine Ridge Road." I hit send, then immediately powered the phone off again and hid it back in its spot in the closet, just as I heard Henry's footsteps coming back down the hallway. "Breakfast is ready," he called brightly. "I made your favorite scrambled eggs with toast." I joined him in the kitchen and saw that he had already plated my food and poured my coffee. The eggs looked perfectly ordinary, but I no longer trusted anything he handed me. "This looks wonderful," I said, taking a small bite. The eggs tasted normal. The coffee, too, had its usual familiar flavor. I ate slowly, deliberately, leaving most of the food untouched. "You're not very hungry this morning," Henry observed. "I think the stress has taken my appetite," I answered, "but the coffee is perfect." I took several more sips, testing for any odd bitterness or unfamiliar note. It tasted exactly as it always did. Either Henry was saving his chemical tricks for later, or he felt so sure of his control that he didn't see any need to drug me again yet. As we sat at the kitchen table, I studied his face. The concerned sun mask was back in place, but now I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was already mentally walking through the trip to Lake Tahoe, working out the details of how to make my death look accidental. "When would you like to drive up to the property?" I asked. "Today or tomorrow?" "Today might be better," he replied. "The forecast says rain tomorrow. That could make the mountain roads more dangerous." Dangerous. The choice of word was no accident. It fit neatly into his narrative about the risks facing an unstable older woman making poor decisions. "That sounds perfect," I said. "Should I pack an overnight bag? We could stay at the cabin, make a little vacation out of it." His eyes lit up. An overnight stay would give him even more time and freedom to arrange an accident with no witnesses. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "The mountain air and change of scenery will be good for your mental state. I'll pack some of Uncle Robert's herbal tea collection. He left quite a variety in the cabin, and I know you've developed an interest in natural remedies." For just a moment, his confident expression slipped. The mention of herbal teas clearly unsettled him, probably a reminder of how easily his original plan had gone wrong when Avery drank the dose intended for me. "That's thoughtful," he said carefully, "but I think it's best if you avoid any unusual herbal mixtures right now. Your system needs time to stabilize." "Of course, you're absolutely right," I agreed. "I'll stick to regular tea and coffee." All the while, I was already planning how to use his own methods against him. Robert had indeed left a large collection of medicinal herbs at the Lake Tahoe cabin, and unlike Henry, whose knowledge came from shallow internet searches, I had actually studied botanical medicine in my younger years. I knew which plants caused digestive upset without doing lasting harm, which tinctures could induce brief confusion and weakness, and, most importantly, how to mask bitterness so thoroughly that even a suspicious person would drink without thinking twice. While Henry packed his overnight bag, I packed my own, and added a few extra items. Hidden among my clothes and toiletries, I slid in several small vials of concentrated herbal extracts I had prepared years before and kept for emergencies. I also packed Robert's journal, a worn notebook full of his meticulous notes about the medicinal plants that grew in and around the property. My brother had been even more knowledgeable about herbal medicine than I was. His journal was like having a local pharmacy's reference manual in paper form. "Are you ready to go?" Henry asked, appearing in my doorway, car keys in one hand, bag in the other. "Almost," I said. "I just want to make sure I have everything I might need." As I zipped up my bag, a calm, steely resolve settled over me. Henry believed he was taking me to an isolated cabin where he could eliminate me without interference. He didn't realize he was stepping into a trap I was quietly setting for him. The drive to Lake Tahoe took just over 2 hours. Henry kept up a steady stream of conversation, carefully reinforcing his story about my supposed decline. "Do you remember the last time you visited Uncle Robert's place?" he asked as we navigated the winding mountain roads. "Not clearly," I said. "Everything from the last few months feels a little hazy." "That's understandable," he replied soothingly. "Grief and stress can really impact memory and cognitive function in people your age," Henry said smoothly. "People your age." He kept repeating that phrase as if turning 60 meant I was halfway in the grave and no longer capable of clear thought. "I hope spending some time in Robert's place will help me feel closer to him," I said. "I'm sure it will," Henry replied, "and it'll give us a chance to evaluate the property objectively and make some practical decisions about its future." When we pulled up to the cabin, a wave of emotion washed over me that had nothing to do with Henry's plans. Robert had poured his soul into this place, and it showed in every beam and stone. The log cabin sat on a rise overlooking the lake, surrounded by tall pines and the wild herb gardens he'd tended for decades. "It's beautiful," Henry said, but I could hear the calculation in his voice as he silently tallied its market value. "Robert spent 40 years making it perfect," I replied. "He always said this was the one place in the world where he truly felt at peace." We unloaded our bags and settled in. Henry immediately began exploring, walking through every room, stepping out on the deck, peering down the slope toward the lake. It was obvious he wasn't admiring the rustic charm. He was checking sightlines, imagining falls, evaluating just how isolated we really were. "The nearest neighbor is over a mile away," he noted. "Very private." "Yes," I said. Robert valued his solitude. That evening, I made dinner with the groceries we'd brought. I cooked openly, deliberately, making sure Henry could see every ingredient that went into the food. I needed him relaxed, confident, convinced that I was no threat. After we ate and the sun began to sink in a blaze of color over the water, I made my move. "Why don't we have some tea on the deck?" I suggested. "What a wonderful idea," Henry said. "Let me make it for you. You should sit and enjoy the view." "Actually, I'd like to do it myself," I replied. "It would make me feel closer to Robert, using his kitchen, his tea collection." He hesitated. He clearly wanted to control everything that went into my body, but refusing would look strange. "Of course," he said finally. "I'll just enjoy the sunset." In Robert's kitchen, I worked with absolute precision. I brewed 2 cups of tea. Henry's cup got a carefully measured blend of herbs that I knew would cause severe nausea, weakness, and temporary disorientation, but no lasting damage. Mine contained nothing but chamomile and honey. I knew the effects would start within about 30 minutes. By then, I intended to be far from the cabin, in a safe place where I could watch and decide what to do next. "Here you are," I said lightly, handing him the steaming mug as we sat on the deck. This was one of Robert's favorites. He always said it helped him sleep peacefully. Henry took it without suspicion. In his mind, his confused, aging mother couldn't possibly outsmart him, let alone turn his own tactics against him. "Smells amazing," he said, taking a deep sip. "Very relaxing." I watched him drink, feeling no guilt. This man had imprisoned me in my own home, drugged me, and brought me here to arrange my death. Compared to what he'd planned for me, a few hours of violent discomfort was merciful. "I think I'll walk down to the lake for a bit," I said once he'd finished most of his tea. "The evening air feels wonderful." "That's a good idea," he said approvingly. "Light exercise is excellent for your overall health." I walked calmly toward the shore, counting minutes in my head. By the time the herbs took full effect, I was hidden in the trees surrounding the cabin, my emergency phone in hand, watching the cabin from a distance. 25 minutes after he drained his cup, I heard him call my name, strained, panicked. A moment later, he staggered out onto the deck, clutching at the railing, looking for me. From my hiding place among the pines, I could see everything. The herbs were doing exactly what I'd intended. Dizzy spells, waves of nausea, weakness, confusion, but nothing that would kill him. Watching my son suffer the fear and helplessness he'd planned for me didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it might. Instead, it filled me with a deep, aching sadness for the boy I once knew, the child I'd loved, and the man he'd chosen to become. But beneath that sadness was something unexpected: freedom. For the first time in months, I was the one in control. I stayed hidden for nearly an hour, watching him stumble, sit, double over, call my name again and again. When I judged that the herbs had fully run their course and his threat level was lowered, I walked back toward the cabin as if I'd merely taken a long, peaceful stroll by the lake. "Henry, what's wrong?" I called from the path, adding just the right hint of worried confusion to my voice. He was sitting on the deck steps, pale, sweating, his head buried in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were unfocused, his fear very real. "Mom, something's wrong," he gasped. "I feel awful, dizzy, nauseous. I think I might pass out." "Oh my goodness," I said, sounding alarmed. "What could have caused that? Should we drive to the hospital?" I don't think I can drive," he managed. "Everything's spinning, and my stomach..." He doubled over again, retching, and I knew the herbs were working exactly as I'd calculated. "Well, we can't stay here if you're seriously ill," I said, letting a thoughtful pause stretch between us. "Let me think." "You know," I said lightly, "Uncle Robert always warned that some of his herb combinations could cause strong reactions in people who weren't used to them. Did you drink the tea I made?" Henry's eyes widened as the realization hit him. "The tea? You think the tea did this?" "It's possible," I replied. "Robert's blends were quite potent. He always told me to be careful with the dosage." I sat beside him and put on my most worried mother expression. "I'm so sorry, dear. I should have thought about that before offering it to you." "How long will this last?" he asked, his voice thin and frightened, suddenly sounding like a little boy instead of a man planning murder. "I'm not sure," I said. "Robert never told me much about specific effects or how long they'd last, but I think the best thing is for you to rest and let it work out of your system naturally." As I spoke, my mind was already 3 steps ahead. Henry would be incapacitated for several more hours. That was enough time to do what I needed to do. I helped him inside, settled him on the couch, brought him water, and fussed over him like the devoted mother he'd been pretending to deserve. "Try to sleep," I said gently. "I'll keep an eye on you and make sure you're okay." Once he drifted into a fitful, uncomfortable sleep, too sick to focus on anything except his own misery, I got to work. First, I used my spare phone again to text Margaret. "I'm safe for now." Henry became ill after drinking some of Uncle Robert's herbal tea. "I'll keep you updated. If anything happens to me, tell the police Henry's been planning to harm me for my inheritance." Then I went through Henry's belongings. His phone was a gold mine. I photographed everything with my spare phone, text to Avery talking about their financial desperation and speculating about when I might pass naturally, search history full of queries about herbal substances and their effects on elderly people, draft emails to estate attorneys asking how to speed up inheritance processes. Most damning of all was a voice recording he'd made, apparently as a personal log of his progress. "Day 2 of the intervention," Henry's voice said clearly from his own phone. "Mom is showing expected signs of compliance after last night's mild sedative. The paranoid episode seems to have convinced her she needs help, which will make the psychiatric evaluation much easier. If Dr. Brennan cooperates as expected, we should have legal control of her assets within 2 weeks. The Lake Tahoe trip will provide the perfect opportunity for a more permanent solution if the legal route proves too slow or complicated. A more permanent solution. My son had calmly narrated my murder like it was a project plan. I saved copies of everything to my spare phone, then composed a detailed email to the local police department outlining Henry's actions and attaching the evidence, screenshots, photos, the audio file, everything. I scheduled the email to send automatically in 12 hours if I didn't cancel it, my insurance policy. Even if something happened to me, the truth would still reach someone. When Henry woke up the next morning, he looked physically better but shaken to his core. "How are you feeling?" I asked, bringing him coffee and toast. "Much better, thanks," he said. That was terrifying. I've never felt so helpless. The irony was almost unbearable, but I only nodded sympathetically. "I'm just glad you're okay. I was worried I might have accidentally caused something serious." "No lasting damage, I think," he said, "but it definitely gave me a new perspective on how dangerous these natural remedies can be when you don't know what you're doing." "Yes," I replied calmly. "Knowledge is very important when you're dealing with substances that can affect people's health and well-being." Henry shot me a sharp look, as if he'd heard something beneath my words that he didn't quite understand. "I think we should head home today," he said. "This trip didn't go exactly as I planned." "Of course," I agreed, "but first, I want to show you something." I led him into Robert's study, where my brother had kept his most important documents. I pulled a thick folder from the shelf and handed it to Henry. "Uncle Robert's will and estate documents," I said. "I thought you might be interested in seeing how he structured my inheritance." Henry opened the folder eagerly, scanning through the legal language for details about the money and property he thought he'd eventually claim. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "I don't understand," he said finally. "This says the inheritance is held in a trust, with specific conditions on distribution." "That's right," I said. "Very specific conditions." "What conditions?" he demanded. I smiled, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction, as I finally spoke the words I'd been waiting to say since he'd revealed who he truly was. "The trust stipulates that if I die within 5 years of receiving the inheritance, or if there are any suspicious circumstances surrounding my death, the entire amount goes to Robert's chosen charities. Not to me, not to my heirs, to them. Nothing goes to my heirs." Henry stared at me, the meaning slowly sinking in. "But that would mean," he began. "That would mean that if you died, I wouldn't get anything." "It means," I said evenly, "that killing me would guarantee you never see a cent of Robert's money. In fact, it would make sure you lose it forever." I watched the blood drain from his face as he realized his entire scheme had been doomed from the start. "And there's more," I continued. "Robert added a very specific clause about any attempt to coerce or harm me in order to reach this inheritance. Any proof of that automatically sends everything to charity, whether I live or die." "You knew," he whispered. "You've known this whole time." "I've known since yesterday morning," I said. "When I found your posts online and understood what you were planning, I went to my safe deposit box and reread the trust documents before I agreed to come on this trip." Henry sank into Robert's desk chair, like the air had been punched out of him. "So everything I've done was for nothing." "Worse than nothing," I said. "You've created a detailed trail of elder abuse, attempted poisoning, and planned murder, for an inheritance you could never have gotten by hurting me." I took out my spare phone and showed him the images and files I'd saved. "I have recordings, screenshots, your text messages, your search history, and your own voice memo where you talk about a permanent solution to your financial problems. What are you going to do with all that?" he asked quietly. "That," I said, "depends entirely on you." I sat down across from him, looking at the man who legally was my son, but felt like a stranger. "You have 2 options, Henry. You can disappear from my life entirely, or you can face the legal consequences of what you've tried to do." "What do you mean, disappear?" "I mean you leave," I said. "You pack your things. You walk out of my life and never come back. No calls, no visits, no messages, no dramatic apologies. You accept that I am no longer your mother and you are no longer my son." "And the other option?" "Then I hand everything over to the police," I said calmly. "The audio, the texts, the notes. I'll include Avery's testimony about your financial desperation and planning. You'll be looking at charges for attempted poisoning, elder abuse, unlawful confinement, and conspiracy to commit murder." He sat in silence for several long minutes, absorbing that reality. Then he looked up at me with something that almost resembled respect. "You really planned this perfectly," he said. "I had an excellent teacher," I replied. "You taught me a lot about manipulation and long-term planning these past few weeks." "And there's really no way," he asked slowly, "for me to inherit anything from you?" "None," I said. "Robert made sure of that. He saw something in you years ago that I refused to see. That's why he designed the trust this way." "Uncle Robert never liked me," Henry muttered. "Uncle Robert saw through you," I corrected. "He knew that if something ever happened to me, you'd be the first person anyone would suspect, so he made it financially useless for you to harm me." Henry stood up, moving like a man who'd suddenly grown old. "What about Avery?" he asked. "What about her? Will you tell her what I planned?" "That's between you and whatever's left of your conscience," I said. "But I will say this. She deserves to know who she married before she wastes more of her life on you." The drive back to Sacramento was completely silent. No apologies, no excuses, no more speeches about family. When we got to my house, Henry gathered his things in silence and loaded them into his car. Just before he got in, he turned back to me. "I really did need that money, Mom," he said. "Avery and I are drowning in debt. I didn't see any other way out." "You could have asked me for help," I replied. "You could have talked to me honestly. Instead, you decided I was a problem to remove, not a mother who might have tried to support you." "Would you have helped?" he asked. "Really?" I thought about it. "Before all this?" "Probably," I said. "I would have found a way to help you without putting my own future at risk. But now, after seeing what you're capable of? No, Henry, I wouldn't trust you with a single dollar, let alone my life savings." He nodded, understanding that this was final. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sure you are," I answered. "But some lines, once you cross them, you can never go back." I watched him drive away, and for the first time in months, I felt truly safe in my own home. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my house, divorce papers addressed to Henry. Avery had apparently learned what he'd been planning, whether from him or from her own suspicions, and she'd made the same choice I had. She preferred being broke and safe over being married to a man willing to kill for cash. I eventually moved to the Lake Tahoe cabin full-time, finding peace in the sanctuary Robert had built. His inheritance allowed me to live comfortably and support the causes I cared about, exactly as he'd intended. Sometimes I still think about Henry. I wonder if he learned anything from what happened, or if he simply went looking for another target, another scheme. But most of the time, I don't let my mind go there. In those dark weeks when I believed my own son was plotting my death, I learned something about myself. I learned that I am stronger, more resourceful, and far more capable of protecting myself than I ever imagined. That kind of knowledge is worth more than any sum of money. And now, I'm curious about you, the one listening to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever faced something even remotely similar? Tell me in the comments. And while you're here, on the final screen, I'm leaving 2 more of our channel's favorite stories. They'll definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.